So I wanted to thank you for doing this interview. Can you please state your name, the year that you were born, and then your place of residency during the Civil Rights Movement?
Kevin Scarlett. My birth date is 8/23, August 23rd, 1957. My place of residency would have been Decatur, Illinois, but that's where I was born and lived. But during this time period that we're talking about, I was at college, which was in Carbondale, Illinois, and I would go on weekends to visit my parents at the farm ground that we had down there in Mount Vernon, Illinois.
Cool. So, what was the dynamic like between blacks and whites when you were young?
Well, that's a dynamic question about dynamics. Well, where I grew up in Decatur, I think I told you guys many times that my high school, for instance, was like 63% black. Mm-hmm. So we had more of a black influence than white. Very little Mexican, mm-hmm. Latina, and very little Asian. And so that's what it was like growing up. Of course, at college, it's quite a bit different. In my particular college, we had an influx of Iranians because of a deal that a governor had made. So we had like about a third of our school was Iranian all of a sudden, and that was before, that was when we were allied with Iran and trying to train their pilots. At any rate, so there was I probably had as much or more black friends as I did white friends growing up, just because of the number of folks you lived around. So we heard of other communities that would bus people to one area of the town, and that wasn't us, but we knew of folks that were set up that way. And quite frankly, that always struck me as everybody that I encountered that were lived in that environment basically didn't like it. It didn't matter if they were black or white, or whichever side they were on, if you will. They didn't like the idea of being bused to equate something, whether it was and it was usually at the time it was intended that blacks in poor neighborhoods were being bused to richer white neighborhoods, and quite frankly, it didn't always work out that way. Anyway, so I don't know if that makes sense or not. But that was my growing up time in Decatur, Illinois. And just to give you an idea for those in this area, I don't know who the audience would be, but if it's in the Pacific Northwest, Decatur would be a lot like Tacoma. Okay. And between Tacoma and Spokane as far as size. So, anyway.
So did the Civil Rights Movement change that dynamic at all?
Not in my view. We could see what was happening at other communities.
Yeah.
And of course, especially the stuff in the South and the Southeast was pretty intense, and quite frankly, a lot of the unrest was around the forced nature of things. In other words, if they would have, in my view, if they would have focused on maybe busing in teachers and upgrading schools as opposed to taking all the folks and trying to send them to another location. Might have ended up a little bit better, but it was all of that sort of false. Somebody sat in a room and decided these folks need to go over here to have a better school. And again, from my interaction with folks, no matter which side of that you were on, it was not pleasant. And so that's, in my view, that's why there was a lot of unrest to begin with. So it sort of took a situation and made it worse. But again, I had it of perhaps a more, I don't know, I had a view where I had a lot of friends that were black. So it wasn't, it wasn't the way some other folks were dealing with, I guess.
Did you ever have any interactions with the KKK? And what was that like?
Yeah, sorry, I laugh. Because you've heard one of the stories anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this was down in southern Illinois. So if you got up around Decatur, that I said that I grew up in, there really wasn't, all that you heard about KKK was in some other location. It was always depicted as being down around Kentucky or Georgia, Alabama. And yet when I went to college, then I told you I was down at Carbondale. You can look at that on the map in Illinois. So it was all in Illinois. So Carbondale is very southern Illinois, whereas Decatur is right in the center. Decatur is almost dead center of the U.S., quite frankly. I'm not saying that to be geocentric, but just a little bit north, gosh, I remember it's about an hour, half hour to an hour, north of the college town was Mount Vernon, and the actual burg that they were in was called Texaco. That was population 7. If you've ever heard of a population, in fact, when my parents died, it was 5. It didn't really change the population. I mean, there was never an influx because it's all farm ground. Anyway, so when I was down there, and during the summers, I worked with a civil engineering firm. And at one point, the lead civil engineer was Chinese. At one point, we were working late in the day, and I had the sheriff from the town drop in, and I forget his name, but he dropped in, and my boss said, "Hey, Kevin, we're going over to the meeting. You want to join us?" And I said, "Well, what meeting are you talking?" I was trying to figure out what it was, like a Rotary Club meeting or what. And nobody heard him talking about it before. And he said, "Oh yeah, it's this little meeting that we're getting together with, and you're welcome to join if you want to." And so it was just all sort of matter of fact. And I said, no, I'm tied up this evening. This was on a Friday, late Friday. And didn't really think much of it. And I found out later, after they had left, I had one of the other coworkers come over and say, "You know where they were going, don't you?" I said, "No." And he said, "They're going to the KKK rally." And I go, "What?" again, so I grew up at Decatur. Now Decatur is only, about 2.5 hours north of that? Yeah, I'd say about 2.5 hours north of the farm. And about 3.5 north of the school. Anyway, so the point is, even though there's that distance, I had never really heard of that actually happening. And it's not like they walked out with hoods under their arms. However, I found out later that that's how they would dress. Usually they would do the hoods to conceal their identity. And so the odd thing about that is that everybody who was, a politician or some higher worker or a bank manager or whatever, they were all at the meeting pretty much. I mean, it was pretty prolific. And in that locale, there were very few black people. There were some, but there weren't very many. And so anyway, that was that particular interaction. And then there was a time when I told you I had close black friends all through my life. And Randy Jackson was one of my first friends at college. And at one point, and I forget exactly what we were talking about, and I said, Randy, why don't you come over to the farm? He goes, okay, that sounds kind of fun. We're going to take a weekend and do that. And so, didn't really think much of it. He's driving with me. Well, we got off of the main interstate and off on the side roads. It was funny to him afterwards too. But so we drove up to this four-way intersection. We could see a bunch of people. You ever seen these firemen have their boots to make collections?
Yeah.
It looked like that sort of thing. However, the people looked like you could tell from probably about a half a mile away it was KKK because of the hoods and the other stuff around the intersection. So, but it really wasn't set up like a blockade. It was set up to hand out flyers for the upcoming KKK meeting. Here we are coming home for the weekend. And I was going, oh boy. And of course, Randy was just, his eyes were as big as saucers. He was he was scared. Wanted to turn around. And I go, no, it'll be okay. And again, the one piece I didn't go into about the other stuff that I'd encountered, I'd never been to a meeting, but I knew the people that had been, and some of them. And I didn't see any direct danger. In other words, there was a lot of talk, there was a lot of bad mouthing, but there wasn't any real danger happening. Would it be possible that if we were driving Randy's car or my car, that they could have keyed my car I was driving my car. That they would have keyed my car or punctured a tire or something like that. Yeah, that's possible. In anger and maybe broke a window. That's about as far as it would go. So there was like this understood tolerance, and I know that doesn't make sense to a lot of people, but I had just a little side note. When I was in my last year of high school, senior year in high school, I had a close friend that didn't know better, and he crossed the Union line at ADM. ADM is Archer Daniels Minden in Decatur, and he crossed that picket line because he was a young kid like me. He was found pushed down an elevator shaft. So that was a reality when it came to unions. So if you had a fear for direct retribution, it was a union scenario. This other stuff was really more paper tiger, if you will. Anyway, so that's why I was saying that. The reality was you had a lot more chance of being injured by that sort of thing. Of course, that's easy for me to say. For Randy, he was just scared and wanted to get out of there. And
Yeah.
I don't blame him. But at this point, we were past the intersection with the handouts. And we had about, I'm sorry, I shouldn't laugh, but it's funny after the fact. We had about, I don't know, 8 or 10 miles to go yet to get to the farm. And I looked back in the rearview mirror, and there was a couple of guys following us. And one of them was straight out of the stereotype, you know, the big truck with lights on the top of the truck, and the guys in back with their shotguns. And just crazy. Well, they never tried to pass us or anything, but they definitely were tracking behind us. At that point, when I discovered that, I took off faster.
Right.
And then got into the farm. Now, this was before cell phones. Okay, so I didn't have. If I would have pulled off to stop and call my dad to say what was happening,
Yeah.
that would have put him in danger.
Right.
So I just kept going, and my dad, fortunately, was watching for us. And the farm is, Illinois is big and flat, and you can see stuff, you know, see somebody coming from 10 miles away. Easy.
Right.
And he had determined what was happening. And so as we pulled in, and I was just barreling at that point. It must have been close to 90 miles an hour, and I'm going down this back road.
Yeah.
And so I pull in the driveway, and my dad at that point is on the porch with his shotgun. And I'm wondering, okay, what the heck? And Randy's really going. I said, it's not my dad. My dad's fine.
Right.
And he immediately passes us and walk coming out. I shouldn't say walking because he was running out there. But so he passed us, and the guys had pulled in. The two trucks had pulled in behind me on the driveway, and my dad said, "You boys better get on out here," because he could tell. My dad didn't really mince any words.
Yeah.
And it's not like we're going to talk about this. You're just going to get out of here. This is my ground, and I said, "You got to hand over that nigger. You got to hand over that nigger to us." And my dad said, "You just get on out here. This boy is a friend of my boys, and you don't have any part here. This is our ground." And so they, of course, were getting more riled up, and a couple of them had jumped out of their beds of the truck, which was a mistake. So my dad shot into the air, and then it was a pump. He had his pump 12 gauge.
Yeah.
Shot into the air and said, "That was the warning. The next one's coming at you."
Oh my gosh.
So, and so
Yeah.
at this point, Randy's in the house because I said just run on in. And I think my mom had brought me out the other shotgun. We have a lot of guns on the farm. Guns are not bad, by the way. People that are bad. And so, yeah, so we basically, my dad warned them off. And after the one shot, they kind of took that seriously. Of course, he was trained on them at that point, so it wasn't just in the air. It was
Right.
the one shot was in the air, and then he said the next one's coming at you. So who's going to be first?
Mm.
And that was their kind of really good question because they started looking at each other.
Mm.
Anyway, so they got back in their trucks and drove off. And then the other oddity with that is that then there was a neighbor, probably lived 4 or 5 miles away.
Mm-hmm.
Within minutes of this, there was a neighbor that was calling my dad saying, I hear you holding up a nigger down there.
Mm.
And my dad said, no, this guy's, I'll leave his last name off of it, his first name is Ken.
Mm.
My dad said, now Ken, don't be talking that way. This is my boy's friend. He's over from college. They're here to visit for the weekend.
Mm-hmm.
And so he wanted to still badmouth him, and my dad just said, that's not going to hold here.
Mm-hmm.
So if anybody steps foot on my property, I'm going to assume it is in ill, he didn't use those terms, but I'm going to assume it's in bad intent, because I'd be cussing right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll shoot him. I'm not going to.
Yeah.
And this was actually back in the time where that was kind of understood, I guess. In other words, if somebody made a threat like that, it was taken seriously.
Yeah.
It wasn't somebody just trying to puff up their chest.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, that was kind of that. And I will say for the first night, Randy, we stayed 2 nights. For the first night there, he was kind of, didn't sleep too well.
Well, yeah.
And I will say that my dad and I stood watch.
Mm.
Because we didn't take that lightly either, so we're not just going to sort of wait around.
Mm-hmm.
So was that real?
Yeah.
But again, it was somewhat, that same thing was totally unheard of 3 hours north of that.
Mm.
And yet down here it's sort of expected, and then as I understood, when you went further south from there, that's when it really got into the violence really occurring with I'm not saying anything good about KKK, I'm just saying that up where we were, they were really kind of paper tigers. When they got down south, that's when they were really getting people and inflicting harm, and I think these people were trying to act that way up here, but when they met a little bit of opposition, they went away. We would have had a real fight on our hands if we would have been another few hours south, is my point.
Yeah.
So it was very, very geographic, if you will. And from my experience, all of this stuff kind of relates back to your experience, what you're brought up with, the folks that you interact with. And so there's, of course, a pretty big history of folks from the South having things forced on them that they didn't want on both sides of the issue.
Sure.
And to me, again, that's where some of the biggest issue was. In other words, out of that whole thing, I think there's perhaps a way, or ways, multiple ways that you could interact and handle the issues a lot better. So it's definitely a dark chapter in our history to deal with. So.
Yeah. Do you think Grandpa's response, so your dad, do you think his response to the KKK was also due to his experiences, or do you think it was part of...
Yeah, however, I think his was from the military, really. because, well, military, and then after the military, we were more up north.
Yeah.
So, you know, I don't want to simplify it to tolerance versus, because it's not. It's not
Yeah.
a tolerance thing. It's just an understanding of, you know, if you've never had a friend even who's black, or you've never interacted on more than just like at an office level or in a school classroom,
Yeah.
then you're not really ever going to know. You can have an opinion. Everybody's got opinions.
Mm-hmm.
But, and out of everybody, doesn't matter your race, out of everybody, it's going to be you're going to have good white people, you're going to have bad white people,
Mm-hmm.
and the whole gamut in between.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to have good black people, you're going to have bad black people, and all about in between.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really not a matter of, at least, the race. Now,
Yeah.
when I say that, I know from the friends that I had that were black, they always had some would have a chip on their shoulder.
Mm-hmm.
Some would have a real fear
Mm-hmm.
of being able to, not necessarily being hurt, some of them would, but of being able to really make it in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And those were, in my view, justified.
Mm-hmm.
But then I had friends that, maybe it's just because of the people I hung around with, but the friends that I had would have never been part of an entitlement society. They never would have been part of, well, you owe this to me because of this that happened there.
Yeah.
I'm going, hey, I didn't do
Right.
I didn't do that.
Right.
We never really had that kind of interaction because they knew I didn't, and I knew that wasn't their purpose, was to try to get some sort of payback for that, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that makes sense, but
Yeah. That does.
It's kind of difficult. I mean, shoot, we could go back to medieval times, and I can be upset with how the English handled my Irish ancestors.
Yeah.
I mean, where does it end, or how the Irish? Well, I'm Irish and English, so but how we were and Scottish. I'm a real mix, huh?
Mm-hmm.
How we were treated when we came stateside,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Right.
So, anyway, but out of all that said, I think there's a long way to go, a real long way to go with race relations in our country, but it's not just black and white.
Yeah.
It's silly to think that it's just black and white.
Yeah.
What I think would be a thing for folks to focus on is that, to me, one of the beauties of America, if you will, is that we're a melting pot.
Mm-hmm.
So when we come here, we can celebrate being Mexican
Mm-hmm.
without jamming that down somebody's throat, that you better
Mhm.
accept me being Mexican.
Mm-hmm.
Well, wait a minute, I should accept you being an American.
Mm-hmm.
And then are you welcome to practice whatever you want in religion and with your background from your Mexican culture? Certainly.
Mm-hmm.
Why not? But
Yeah.
that's a big difference than somebody essentially forcing that on somebody else.
Mm.
I only pick on that because in our particular locale, Washington is kind of more of an outgrowth from California
Mm-hmm.
relative to Spanish-speaking language and influence, and which, by the way, I'm not against. I'm just saying that we need to watch how things are forced. When you start forcing things, it's almost generally unnatural. That's where the issues are going to be in your future. They may not have even manifested themselves yet, but they will. Things that are forced on, that are made up in some room somewhere and don't have any real basis of helping the public and the parties involved. Generally are trying to fill some politicians' success. So, anyway.
Cool. Well, those are all of my questions. Did you have anything else that you would like to add?
Well, let me see. We've come kind of full circle from civil rights in the 60s to bilingual effects in the U.S. But not really, other than I really hope that the young kids that you end up teaching someday, and that the rest of my kids growing up get a good dose of history that they can take with them, because the one thing that you will learn, and this is my little parting shot there, is that if you don't ultimately learn from history, you will be bound to repeat it. So do you want to go through what you were reading in the 60s with civil rights? It won't be in the same exact fashion.
Right.
But if you don't try to nip it in the bud and solve the issues for the right reasons, and stop trying to make decisions that will satisfy some politician. If you don't learn from that stuff, it'll end up coming back. It won't go away, is the point.
Yeah.
And, here we are in the, about almost 2020. And I would say that race is coming back to be an issue of concern in our country.
Yeah.
And I don't believe we'll be able to rely on the old civil rights laws to resolve things. We have different issues, we have different reasons. So, we're I was just going to say our culture right now is on the brink of anarchy, in my view, with the things that are happening in our country, and when you lose our rule of law and our ability to enforce it. I know you guys hear the words anarchy, but I've talked with a lot of folks that are about my age that are saying they never would have dreamed that we would be near this now. We thought that things would be in a totally different state.
Yeah.
So it's unfortunately it's a thing that you guys are going to have to deal with in your lifetime. And I just hope and pray that it's going to be to the positive, and you're not going to end up like some of those sci-fi movies where things are being ruled in the street.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah.